You know the play and the movie Amadeus by Peter Shaffer? In the play and in the movie, there's a young boy named Salieri, remember? And Salieri, at one point, offers up this prayer to God. Lord, he says, make me a great composer. Let me celebrate your glory through music and be famous through the world. In return, I will give you my chastity, my industry, my deepest humility, every hour of my life, and I will help my fellow man all I can. Amen. Now he begins life after making that prayer with this deal he's made with God, and he starts to serve God. And in all the ways that he knows, he keeps his hands off women. He works hard at his music. He helps the poor tirelessly. He gives musicians lessons for free. He goes to church all the time. And for a while, it looks like God is holding up his end of the bargain. His career starts to go, he starts to move, he becomes court composer. Everything's going well. And if you know the movie or the play, you know, until he comes. Who's he? It's Mozart. And when Mozart comes to Vienna, everything starts to change for Salieri. Because Mozart's massive genius shows up Salieri's mediocre gifts. And Mozart's success begins to eclipse Salieri. And Salieri can't understand it. And here's the reason why. Because according to the play, I know it's not necessarily true according to history, but according to the story, the narrative of the play, the movie, Mozart is very opposite. He is vulgar. He is immoral. He is irreligious in every way. And yet God keeps blessing him. And there's one point, you know, in which he's actually watching Mozart cheating on his fiancée. And in the play, I don't think it's in the movie, in the play, Salieri says, it was incomprehensible. Here I was denying all my natural lust every day to deserve God's gift. And here was Mozart indulging his in all directions without a rebuke from God. Nothing but success. And Salieri begins to burn with anger at the injustice of the way God is allowing life to go. And you know, there's one place, as you might remember in the movie, where finally Salieri picks up the crucifix off the wall and throws it into the fire. Remember, the first time I ever watched this movie in South Philly in the 1980s, everybody gasped. It was sort of a conservative Roman Catholic neighborhood, if I remember correctly. He takes off the crucifix, he throws it in the fire, and he says, from now on, we are enemies, you and I. And Salieri becomes so bitter that he murders Mozart. That's how the story goes. Now, what does this mean? Salieri would certainly say, I was a servant of God. In fact, he actually does this in this confession as an old man to the priest, and that's how you get flashbacks and hear this whole story. Salieri says, I was a servant of God. I served my fellow man. I served the poor. I served God. And God made me this murderous wretch because of his absolute injustice. But you see, Salieri is exactly what Satan said Job was. Salieri was telling himself, I'm serving the poor, I'm serving God, but he wasn't. He was serving himself. He was only, God and the poor were useful commodities to get the glory he hungered for. And as soon as God, who he believed owed him because of his good works, as soon as God stopped running history the way Salieri thought he should, he turned and so quickly became far more capable of evil than the vulgar, irreligious Mozart. Far more. Now, what are we supposed to learn from this? Here's what we're supposed to learn. When God shows up, he says in chapter 40, verse 8, it's written down there, he looks at Job and he says, you're trying to justify yourself. This is a very important verse. Notice he's not saying you sinned and therefore you're suffering, because we know that that's not the reason for the suffering. But what he is saying is in your suffering, you are trying to justify yourself. You are saying, this isn't fair. This isn't right. God owes me. Right? And yet, here's what's important. Even though Job has been struggling, and we've seen this, and even though he's yelling and he's saying this isn't right, this isn't fair, how dare you, this is unjust, and yet guess what? Job never throws a crucifix in the fire. Not that he had one, but you know what I mean. Job never turns and tries to kill one of his friends, though, as we've been looking at it, they're really asking for it. He hangs on. He hangs on. He never says, we are enemies, you and I. He hangs on. Why? And here's the complex. Listen, Christianity is not easy. This is complicated. He is not a Salieri. Job is not a Salieri. Why? What makes you a Salieri? What makes you a person who demands that God owes you and cannot handle suffering and injustice because it'll turn you bitter and despondent and maybe even evil? What makes you a Salieri? A person who believes you're saved by works. A person who believes, well, if I live a good life, then God owes me. A person who doesn't understand the gospel, a person who doesn't understand grace. And Job understands basically that and you can see this as you go on, because he does not turn away the way Salieri does. He does not say, we are enemies, you and I, because he basically understands that his relationship with God is based on grace. And yet there's a Salieri in him. He's not a Salieri through and through, but there's something in him. And there's a Salieri in you. Because the default mode of our heart is to say, well, if I do this for God, he owes me here. We may say, we believe we're sinners saved by grace, but deep in our heart, we still want to say, but if I live a good life, and that's what will destroy you in suffering. See, Salieri did not love God for himself alone. Salieri loved God as long as it was paying off. And if God shows up and says to Job, now, Job, you're going to suffer terribly, but 2,000, 3,000 years from now, they're going to be talking about you in New York City. 5 o'clock. Thousands of people will be talking about you. You will have a name that lives forever. Then Job said, okay, well then I'll put up with the suffering. And what have we got? We got a bigger Salieri than we had before. A person who's in it for himself. Don't you want to be loved for yourself? Do you want somebody to love you for your money or for your looks? You say, well, that won't be a problem. Not a problem with me. Nevertheless, every single one of us want to be loved for who we are. That's right. And it's wrong not to love somebody for who they are. And it's wrong not to love God for who he is. And the only way you will ever learn to love God for who he is in himself, for himself alone, not for the benefits you get, is that when suffering comes, you take it. And you rely on the grace of God instead of saying, oh no, you owe me, you owe me. And you rely on the size of God and you say, you know, and I don't. And that will turn you into a great heart. That will turn you into somebody who can help others. That will turn you into someone wonderful.